Welcome to this webinar entitled Dodging Disaster, How Can We Build a Safer World for All? My name is Megan Rowling. I'm going to be moderating today. I'm a journalist with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and I am the editor of Zilliant.org, which is a global hub for resilience practitioners, to which we're contributing alongside the Rockefeller Foundation and two other partners in the project. We're doing this discussion today because next week, as you all know, we have the Cancun Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction coming up. This is the first major meeting, international UN meeting, since the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction was agreed in March 2015. And that was a key step for the post-2015 development agenda, the first step really in terms of formal agreements, and it set 7 targets to help governments and communities boost their disaster risk reduction efforts. Those include things like cutting disaster losses, reducing the number of deaths, protecting critical infrastructure, and improving access to early warning. So 2 years on from that, a little more than 2 years, the Cancun meeting is a great opportunity to see where we've got to so far on the Sendai Framework, which runs through to 2030. And we'll be discussing what focus will be needed to really put Sendai into practice. So we've got two very distinguished guests that we're going to be speaking to today. The first is Ricardo Mena, who since 2009 is Chief of the Regional Office for the Americas at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And there at UNISDR, he manages 35 countries and 15 territories, and he is basically coordinating the global platform in Cancun. And he has 20 years of experience in disaster risk reduction, some of that in the humanitarian sphere, and before that he worked in the private sector in Ecuador. And then we have Dan Lewis, who is the Chief of the Urban Risk Reduction Unit for UN Habitat, the UN Settlements Programme. Dan's a civil engineer and he's worked for UN Habitat since 1997, based in Somalia, Kosovo, Nairobi, and now in Barcelona, and probably a lot more other places in between. Dan has led the development of a UN global programme designing new standards for measuring and monitoring urban resilience, which is called the City Resilience Profiling Programme. And he's also been closely involved in putting together the new Global Alliance for Urban Crises. Before we start, I think something worth considering is that late last year, the World Bank came out with a new report that said natural disasters have a more devastating impact on the poor than people have thought, basically forcing around 26 million people into poverty each year and setting back global spending on goods and services by the equivalent of $520 billion annually, which is huge. And the World Bank reckons that the human and economic costs of disasters caused by extreme weather and earthquakes have been underestimated by up to 60%. So with climate change moving ahead and urbanization getting faster and faster, the background is that it's even more urgent to implement the Sendai Framework as time goes by. So with that in mind, we will start the Q&A with our panelists. The format is that I'm going to ask them a few questions each, and then we're going to bring some of that discussion together. And then for the final part of the webinar, you, the audience, will have the chance to ask questions to the panelists. There is a chat function on the side of your screen where you'll be able to type in your questions. If you could just say who you are and where you're from, and then type in your questions, and you're also free to put in comments, of course, during the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. The hashtag that we're going to be using for this discussion, if there are any prolific tweeters out there, is the hashtag for the Cancun conference, which is hashtag Mexico GP 2017. That's hashtag Mexico GP 2017. So we will start by talking with Ricardo. Ricardo, so you've been terribly busy organising this huge meeting in Cancun, which is going to attract, I think, more than 5,000 experts. It's been 2 years now since the Sendai Framework was agreed. Can you tell us what have been the main steps forward in implementing the Accord so far, and which areas will require the most attention and effort going forward?
Thanks very much, Megan, and hi to all the participants in the webinar. I'm actually very pleased to having had the opportunity to participate. And well, you know, responding to your question, Sendai was adopted, as you said, 2 years ago, and governments and also stakeholders have started analyzing Sendai more in depth to better understand what it means, because Sendai in a way was, you know, an international instrument that made substantive changes to the way in which we were handling disaster risk. And it really changed this paradigm from managing disasters to actually managing disaster risk. And it also came with a broader scope than the previous international instruments had been focusing on, to not only look at natural hazards, but also what we call the man-made hazards as well, technological, biological, etc. So I think that it's slowly, you know, starting to settle down in terms of governments and stakeholders understanding exactly what it means. And indeed, it does mean a very big challenge in many areas. Actually, because it is also the first instrument that has set some global targets. And we have had a period where governments have negotiated what are going to be the indicators to measure the accomplishment of these targets. Countries have now to actually develop systems whereby they will be able to collect the data and information that will be required for them to report on the implementation of the Sendai global targets. And this has many challenges. We have, you know, done a number of analysis on how countries are prepared or not to actually complete what we call the baseline data for the implementation of the Sendai 7 global targets. And it's, you know, very few countries that actually can provide now all the information that's needed to fulfill that purpose. So that's one important target. That's one important challenge as well. But we are very glad with the number of countries that have participating in a pilot test of what will be the Sendai Monitor. We had more than 80 countries participating in this pilot exercise, and that has helped us to fine-tune a little bit all the mechanisms that will be available to governments and others to assess on the implementation of Sendai Framework. And besides that, I think that if you look at each one of the priorities of Sendai Framework, you have, you know, better understanding disaster risk, which is in itself quite a broad aspect that needs to take, you know, be taken into consideration. And little by little, countries are starting to realize the fact that in order to have risk assessments, they also will need some information that may not be available now to do some probabilistic risk assessment in order to determine, you know, with a more precise figure exactly what's their level of exposure in terms of potential losses. And then on governance, you know, you have the same type of situation whereby you need to establish some better accountability from the different layers of government, both at the national but also at the local level. And this is why the you know, disaster risk reduction at local level is so important, to set up legislation and systems that will allow you to actually comply with what Sendai is asking governments to do. But I don't want to extend myself too much. You know, I just want to touch on a few issues that just give you a better understanding of the main challenges that are ahead of us, but also on the way that governments have started to quickly react and try to get ready to face this challenge. And the same happens at local government level as well.
Yeah, I think it's clear that there's quite a lot of theoretical work that needs to be done in terms of being able to measure how Sendai is being put into practice and how disaster risk reduction is progressing. But I remember being in Sendai when the framework was being negotiated, and there was something that happened that really crystallized the issues, which was that Vanuatu was hit by a very bad cyclone during the meeting, and I think that really sort of helped people to understand why do we need to have this framework. And I was just wondering, what kind of things will happen in Cancun? Obviously, we don't want a disaster to happen during the Cancun meeting, but what sort of examples or practical ways do you think governments will demonstrate in Cancun that they're putting DRR into practice more in the way that they're doing things and helping to reduce the risk of disasters to people in their countries?
Yeah, you know that actually the global platform is going to emphasize on action, and we are trying to, you know, avoid having again discussions about things that were already negotiated in Sendai and that are already part of the Sendai framework. So we want to actually start looking at ways in which different governments and organizations have started successfully implementing the Sendai framework. And we have organized a program that actually is quite ambitious in terms of scope and coverage. We have, just to give you a few numbers, we have 21 core sessions of the Global Platforms program, which includes some plenary sessions, special sessions, and 15 working sessions that are going to be covering a broad range of issues related to disaster risk reduction and Sendai framework. And it's interesting to note that how we came up with these, 21 areas of focus of the global platform was through a very open and consultative process with member states of the United Nations and also stakeholder groups to decide what were the key issues that they wanted to have discussed on this first global platform after Sendai. Of course, you cannot cover all the topics, but these were the topics that came out as the main priorities. By the way, anybody who is interested in looking at the whole official program of the global platform, it's already uploaded on the website, so I invite you to look at it. But in addition to these 21 core sessions, we will have 46 side events. We will have also 60 preparatory events, and we will have experts talking about their experiences, their innovative ways in which they are dealing with disaster risk at the Ignite stage, and all sorts of other meetings happening in the margins of the GP.
So you'll have a lot of practical experience for people to take away from there. But one focus session in particular, bringing in leaders, world leaders, is going to be on building more resilient infrastructure and reducing economic losses that way. Can you tell us why is that important and what do you expect to come out of that session?
Yeah, well, this theme was actually a request by the president of Mexico. He wanted the Leaders Forum to emphasize on this topic because Mexico believes that this is one of the most important aspects to move from risk from disaster risk to disaster risk management. Why? Because in a way, you know, development takes place, but if it's not informed by disaster risk, then that development may be actually increasing your stock of risk towards the future. So to put it in practical terms, if you build a school, but you build it in a flood-prone area, or you don't use seismic construction building codes and norms, then what you are doing is building an infrastructure that is very likely to be destroyed whenever a natural hazard manifests itself. So taking into account the fact that in the next 20, 30 years, because of population growth and the urbanization process, of which I'm sure that Dan is going to expand more when he speaks, we know that a lot of infrastructure is going to be built in urban areas particularly, and it will be determinant on what type of robustness and sustainability that infrastructure has, depending on how much disaster risk has actually been taken into account to build that infrastructure on the first place. So that's why this topic is so important, because we know in terms of cost-benefit analysis, when you incorporate disaster risk reduction measures while you are designing and building new infrastructure, then cost-benefit is much more positive than, for example, if you had to retrofit something that has already been built because it was not built to standard. So this is a fundamental aspect.
And I think that's something that's very important for cities, Dan, isn't it, as they develop and as they carry out their urban planning processes. And so I think we'll focus in on cities a little bit now, if that's okay with you, and bring Dan into the conversation. Dan, how would you characterize the progress of DRR efforts at the city level around the world at the moment? Where are we with that? And how does DRR contribute to cities' wider goals to build resilience and develop sustainably? Dan, I think you've got your microphone muted, so we might need to have you benefit from your knowledge. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, both very big questions with big answers. But having been in this environment for many years alongside Ricardo and others, I think one way to look at how cities are emerging, let's say, in the international development agenda is to look at the series of events that took place from March 2015 until October 2016. And note that there were 6 major intergovernmental events that took place, each one of them where member states made commitments to a wide range of different frameworks. The Sendai Framework, for example, followed by the Addis Ababa Financing for Development, followed by the Sustainable Development Goals, followed by COP21, then followed by a non-legislative intergovernmental meeting at the World Humanitarian Summit, and ultimately closing with the Habitat 3 conference. In my experience, I have never seen the emergence of the common thread of urbanization and urban issues in all 6 of those. Hyogo was, as you recall, Ricardo, quite light in terms of its focus on urban, but in the 10 years that elapsed between Hyogo and Sendai, the recognition by the world of the fact that the rate at which the population is increasing and the rates of urbanization around the world are demanding that we have a robust response to the challenges of urbanization, not only with respect to disaster risk reduction, which Ricardo has ably told us is a critical element of for the protection of sustainable development gains in urban areas, but also in terms of transforming the way cities develop over the next 100 years, from the manner in which they've developed over the last 100 years. So at a global scale, how are our cities progressing in terms of risk reduction? Well, every single one of those intergovernmental events also speaks about risk reduction and also speaks about ore resilience, not just from an urban scale, but at an urban scale as well, which is also very important. And then from that sort of global scale, what's also happened over the course of the last few years, basically since 2014, is the emergence of very interesting communities of practice that are gathering together, seeking common ground, finding common purpose, to the best of their abilities, creating common practice or common action. And this is another indicator of the kind of resources that are being made available to cities around the world. One of the most critical and largest networks of actual local governments or cities is, of course, the UNISDR's Making Cities Resilient campaign that was relaunched in June last year, and with a new set of objectives to transform the network to, by 2020, increase the network of cities from around 3,500 up to 5,000. And not just to look forward, but also to look backwards and to reflect on those 3,500 city partners in that campaign, and to look to see where there is a demand or a need to support those cities to progress in achieving their goals in building much more resilient cities. And so this community of practice has emerged, one of which in support of local government goals. Those are the Medellin Collaboration on Urban Resilience, which was launched at the World Urban Forum in 2014. And that brings in the World Bank, the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, the Inter-American Development Bank, of course UNISDR as a co-partner with UN Habitat from the UN side, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative, ICLE, Cities Alliance, and the C40 Group. These are 10 organizations that represent a huge community of practice and resources to support local governments around the world. So what I'm saying is that the agenda has been globalized. The common ground is being sought both laterally or horizontally across the network of cities, and also amongst the communities of practice that are out there generating resources to support those governments.
It seems to me that there's a lot of infrastructure in the sense of networks and groups and tools and things to help cities progress on keeping people safe from disasters and building their resilience. What would you say cities most need in practical terms? What things do they need in order to help them do this work and get to the place that they want to be: green, safe, sustainable, livable places? And how is Cancun going to help them get those things?
Well, it's a continuation of this process of forging common ground and finding common purpose. And the local government summit, which will take place the entire day of the 23rd of May, is a platform for that kind of horizontal networking, knowledge sharing, these kinds of things to take place. So that's on the one side. Practically, you need to have a political commitment. And that political commitment, we already know that political commitment has been made by 3,500 city leaders so far to the campaign. So that's the very first thing. If there's no political commitment, there is very, very little opportunity to create a systematic risk reduction or disaster risk management or a resilience agenda that can be taken forward. And you have to look elsewhere. I see that there's been a question, more than one question coming up on the chat side around communities. In the areas where local governments are weak or in some cases non-existent, the responsibility and the obligation actually translates to networks, other networks or other associations of people, and that means community groups, that means civil society organizations, and other agents of change, let's say. But in large part, what we're focusing on is local government.
Ricardo, sorry, Dan.
No, when I talk about political, there's four things you really need. Okay, so the first is political commitment, and that can take place not necessarily it can take place at a community level if that's the only option. You need time. This stuff doesn't happen overnight, and cities don't transform except in very, very rare and generally horrible circumstances. The opportunities to transform cities in short periods of time doesn't exist. So you need time. To a certain extent, you need money. But our experience is that working with cities and local governments that begin by doing what they can with what they have, in relatively short order, achieving something always draws more interest, and generally it attracts more investment. And so starting with doing what you can with what you have, and we have the frameworks of Sendai, and we have the other frameworks that we can use to help guide us. And fourth, you need capacity. And by that, I don't mean skill necessarily. You need capacity in terms of human resources, in terms of institutional relationships, in terms of some other things we'll talk a little bit about later on, but which Ricardo alluded to, which was about creating legislation that enables these kinds of things to take place. But let me stop there.
So I just wanted to sew things together a little bit. I mean, Ricardo, one of the things that was said about Sendai was obviously it's an agreement that's negotiated between governments, and so it was quite sort of at the national level, and could feel a little bit top down perhaps for people who are working at a very local level. In between that, you have cities that Dan's just been telling us about what's needed, which is political will. And then there's always this feeling that there's perhaps a disconnect between the national level, the city level, and then the community level. And I'm just wondering, you know, has there been anything done in order to improve the connections between those levels, and will we see a good representation of community disaster risk reduction, etc., in Cancun, or will it be very much a kind of government-led process again?
No, not at all. I mean, that's something that is a big and important difference between a world conference, as was Sendai in 2015, and the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. That's in essence a multi-stakeholder type of event. Of course, it has an intergovernmental component, but we will have, you know, from the 5,000 participants that we have registered and expecting to be in Cancun, more than half are actually representatives of stakeholder groups, organizations, and DRR experts. Which, you know, the 40% are representing governments. So there you can see that, you know, the discussion in Cancun is going to be quite open to everybody. Now, how are we making the connections? One aspect that has to be highlighted is the fact that actually Sendai, for each one of the priorities, has, let's say, a recipe to be followed by national and local governments. So it does not only emphasize on the national level, it gives already quite an important set of recommendations, priority by priority, for local governments as well. And we are accompanying this process also with tools that allow local governments to assess where they stand in terms of Sendai implementation and requirements. And this is perhaps one additional point that I would add to those that Dan already talked about, which is providing governments with a very simple tool at the local level so that they can assess more or less what their situation is vis-a-vis Sendai, resilience, disaster risk reduction. And that we have already, and it's a very simple tool that governments can apply based on a number of indicators that let them identify what the gaps are, what are the areas that need to be strengthened. And that's usually how it goes, you know, you come up with some assessment of what the situation is, you identify what are the areas that need to be improved or enhanced, and you develop a plan based on the resources you have available and the capacities that you have at hand to start moving into the DRR direction, let's say. And this is how we have seen sometimes you have a little seed that's planted, and then the activity starts building up within the local government, and it starts growing and growing and growing. And we have seen some cases where actually disaster risk reduction has moved from being a one-person small unit at a very low level to actually being one of the key pillars of the local government administration, with a big deal of priority for implementation. So I think that's another aspect. Now, governments, when they start preparing their reports on Sendai monitoring implementation, they are of course encouraged to bring up the information that comes from local governments. And for that, we are trying to facilitate the interface so that the monitor can actually talk at the national level with those that apply it at the local level. And the other thing that's important about this monitoring process is that it will also contain the indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals that are common between the SDGs, as we know them, of the 2030 Development Agenda, and the Sendai Framework, which are cross-referenced. And we hope that, you know, also with the Climate Change Agreement of Paris, we will have the same process, talking to those that are developing the indicators for the Climate Change Agreement to be implemented, and also with the new urban agenda. And of course, Dan will be able to expand a little bit more on that. But there is a big effort within the United Nations and member states to make sure that the coherence that we talk so much about actually does happen between these 3-4 key international agreements.
Yes, from what I'm hearing, there's that discussion going on at the Bonn climate talks as well at the moment. So it does slowly seem to be happening. I just wanted to turn the conversation over a little bit to something very tangible, which is money. And I wanted to hear your opinion on how much more do we need the world to wake up to the fact that they should be putting money into reducing the risk of disasters rather than clearing up after the disasters hit. It's been a perennial problem with disaster risk reduction that we haven't seen enough investment going into this area of work. Is there going to be anything new on this at Cancun? What are the demands? Do we see a change in attitude towards investment in disaster risk reduction? Or are we still at the stage where the begging bowl goes out and nothing much is coming into it?
No, if I may jump in and start with this one.
Okay.
You know, the losses are increasing so rapidly that governments cannot ignore this problem any longer. Now, that said, of course, it's completely different in terms of what this means to a developed country than what it means to a developing country, and even more so what it means to a small island developing state. Because, you know, we have now new metrics that can, in a way, portray the type of impact that a country suffers from disaster losses. So, of course, if you take the United States, losses are huge, but in relative terms to the economy, they are quite small. But if you take, on the other hand, let's say Dominica or another small island developing state, losses are so huge that they, in some cases, can be, up to 100% of GDP with one single event. So, of course, that puts into perspective a little bit the range of differences that we know exist. So, for a small island developing state, it's actually fundamental for its subsistence to pay more attention to disaster risk. Now, they usually don't have enough resources to do so, and that's when international cooperation needs to kick in. And then, on the other hand, governments are starting to realize that they need to start developing some financial instruments that allow them to have some sort of cushion to not have big cash flow problems when disasters strike. So now you can see, a variety of products that have been developed, including also insurance schemes, but also catastrophic bonds and others that governments can now use to protect themselves to the immediate impact of disasters. But they are also trying to find a better balance between what they are actually spending in terms of disaster response and immediate recovery with what they are spending, not enough now, still, on disaster risk reduction. So the discussion in Sendai, the discussion in Cancun about what Sendai says about all these issues are going to be, of course, trying to, how you say it in English, to hit the nail, if I may, on what are the actual economic implications of disaster risk and what governments need to do. Now, the problem is that, of course, investing in disaster risk reduction sometimes, particularly for politicians, may be seen as a silent investment. And of course, that does not provide any political, any political positive return, if you know what I mean. But actually, at the local level, that's being seen completely differently, because in many countries, actually, mayors are re-elected. And then the time horizon for decision-making is actually longer than for executive power administration in some cases. And then mayors may face the fact that, maybe it's unlikely that you will have to face a disaster in 4 years, but maybe if you don't do something and you stay for 8 years, then you may be liable, and this might have a big political implication on your future.
Dan, on that note, cities do often say, or you hear it said, that they lack the funding and resources needed to build resilience. I mean, is it going to come from the private sector, from the insurance industry? How are these funds going to be found, and what can the private sector do to invest in cities, safer, more resilient cities?
Yeah, well, not to take anything away from what Ricardo said, but the conversation is changing around the world. More and more, I think local government leaders are understanding that the process of risk reduction or resilience building is something that you cannot bolt on to an urban local government budget. You cannot. You have to integrate it in the manner in which the city is planned, in the manner in which the city develops, in the manner in which the city is governed over long periods of time. So in trying to quantify a value for disaster risk reduction based on any one city in any part of the world, this is not the right way to think about this, except as an economic argument. But as a development process argument, it is not helpful. In fact, I think it tends to frighten people away. So more and more what we're talking about is, with our city partners, is capitalizing on trying to extract the positive benefits of urbanization and use those in ways that reduce risk or increase resilience, but as an integrated element of normal urban planning and urban development, urban management processes. So that's one really kind of interesting area of conversation that's taking place. And it's not just conversation, in fact, it's actually being put into practice in many parts of the world. So that's one interesting. The second thing is around the insurance, the whole insurance industry. Historically, the insurance industry it's a bilateral arrangement between the insured and the insurer. And this is kind of strange when you think about who the stakeholders in risk are. That we're now starting to have conversations with some insurance providers about issues related to risk distribution and liability distribution, and drawing a greater array of stakeholders and people for whom that risk, whatever it happens to be, has a value. And in this way, you are able to better capitalize on financing risk at micro scales, not in just one big lump that puts the risk bearer and the risk owner as two halves of a single process. It doesn't rationally work that way. When others are involved and other stakeholders that both contribute to risk and can contribute to the mitigation of risk and increasing resilience. And so, while I'm not disagreeing with Ricardo, I think everything he said is correct, but what is interesting is that there are new conversations emerging about finding ways of integrating risk reduction, resilience building, and they're not the same thing, but into, at least at an urban scale, into longer term development processes.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a different way of thinking about it, a more kind of holistic view. We don't have a lot of time left. I've been watching the comments coming in and the questions on the side in the chat. We won't have time to answer every single one, but I've just been keeping a couple in my mind, concerns that people have. And I think some of them are related to why and how does this process of disaster risk reduction at the international level matter to me. One of the questions was when a child is with her mother in a disaster, what does the mother do? How does this whole process help that woman, for example? Or, you know, I am in a local community or a local government. How and what can this process do for me? And so I was just wondering if perhaps, Ricardo, you could touch very briefly on what's going to happen around gender at Cancun. So perhaps something that might help the mother that our participant was talking about.
Yes, that's a very important question. And before actually addressing the issue of women's role in disaster risk reduction, I would like to emphasize the fact that you know, Sendai was developed as a people-centered instrument for disaster risk reduction. And I think that the person that's putting this question forward actually is touching an issue that I think it's quite important, because this notion of disaster risk reduction has to start from the individual up into society and government, etc. Because if it doesn't, it's you know, quite difficult to actually try to convince people that they should do it. So of course that's also important, but if you have people more conscious about risk, their exposure and vulnerability, then they may actually take very simple measures to either reduce vulnerability or reduce their exposure. So that's why, you know, if you go back to what you were saying at the beginning, Megan, about the World Bank study that talks about how disasters bring 26 million into poverty every year, that's where things start to connect between each other. So We know that poverty equals high level of vulnerability, and that equals also high possibility of impact during a disaster situation. So individuals and families need to start identifying what these vulnerabilities are and what the exposure is. And that can be the first stepping stone. Once you realize that, you are in a much better position to try to get out of that situation. And of course, governments, particularly local governments again, need to facilitate the processes that may allow people living in slums or very high risk areas to provide them with some level of support through conditional cash transfers or through social programs to help them build more resilience into their lives. So that's absolutely fundamental. And then, on the role of women, we see every single time the excellent examples of how women are actually the drivers of initiatives on disaster risk at the community level. And so, instead of being referred to as one of the vulnerable populations, I think that indeed women are some of the excellent examples of how disaster risk reduction can actually be put in place with very low cost, but with an individual decision to build resilience into their families, into their communities. So there will be a woman leaders forum in Sendai also discussing about this important role that women have on disaster risk reduction as a fundamental player and as a very active, proactive, and successful one in bringing about change at the community level to bring the Sendai Framework philosophy, if you want, or lens into the communities.
Thanks, Ricardo. I just wanted to add in a comment that I'm seeing on the side here. Brendan Watt saying, does poverty always have to mean high vulnerability? It seems a very reductionist view. It doesn't always have to, even if it sometimes doesn't. I was just going to comment in relation to that often in some of the poorest communities, I've seen some amazing examples of women who have not been vulnerable, who have fought back and won ways of doing things for their communities that have protected themselves, their children, their families, and so on. So just to finish off, because we don't have much time now, what would be the one thing that you would both like to see emerge from the Cancun meeting? A concrete measure, a change, a decision? What would that be? Dan, would you like to start?
Sure. Ricardo will have heard this for many, many years, but ultimately, as he said earlier, that the Sendai Framework addresses national governments and encourages them to seek input in their reporting on the implementation of the Sendai from local governments. Since the beginning, for the last, 15 years or so, we've been looking for a structured way of linking the achievements, the challenges, first of Hyogo, now of Sendai, and ultimately from the New Urban Agenda, to create structural linkages between local governments and national governments, member states reporting on the implementation of various different frameworks, but specifically in this case, Sendai.
Thanks, Dan. Ricardo, what's the one thing you'd like to have signed, sealed, and delivered at the end of the global platform?
Well, from our perspective, we will have 2 outcome documents that we are very much looking forward to having, sealed and signed and approved. So one is the Cancun communique of the Leaders Forum, and the other one is the chair summary that will, in a way, summarize the main outcomes of the different sessions and how they relate to the 4 priority areas of the Sendai Framework and what are the key recommendations to be followed until the next global platform in 2019 in Switzerland. So I think in a way Cancun will be setting a path to be followed and prioritized for all governments and stakeholders to actually concentrate on that for the next 2 years.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I'm sure you'll have those things by the end of the meeting. I'd like to close now. I'd like to thank Dan Lewis in Barcelona and Ricardo in Cancun for their great insights into what's going to be happening next week. If you would like to follow what's happening next week, Zilliant and the Thomson Reuters Foundation will have a reporter in Cancun filing stories from the meeting, and all those stories will be up on zilliant.org. So please do come back to the website, check to see what's happening, and hopefully we'll see some big steps forward on disaster risk reduction next week in Mexico. Thanks very much, everybody. We'll have a blog and a video of the discussion as well, so you'll be able to check back in on those on zilliant.org too. Thanks very much for joining, and do come back next time. We'll be sending out information about our next webinar, and good luck everybody in Cancun. Bye.